Good evening, everyone. Welcome to TiE Silicon Valley's event today, Fundraising and Startup Strategy in the Pandemic. Angels and also the TiECon co-convener for TiECon 2020. TiECon, our flagship global conference for entrepreneurs and professionals, is now on September 2nd and 3rd, and most likely it'll be virtual. I think it is going to be virtual. And during this pandemic, TiE Silicon Valley is continuing to deliver value by hosting periodic events in several domain areas, such as the one today. TiE Silicon Valley is also very excited to announce a program called Road to TiECon. Events which are longer in length, have more domain-focused multiple tracks. And these anchor events are going to happen once every month, starting in May, late May, June, July, and perhaps September first week. Please do look out for these announcements regarding these events and do register. That said, please let me introduce today's moderator, Jordan Woods, a serial entrepreneur, a seasoned executive, a technologist, among other things. He has also been very active in the TiE community and in TiECon. He is the chair for blockchain and fintech track for this year's TiECon as well. I would like also to thank Prashant Shah, Radhika Iyengar, who's one of the co-conveners for TiECon along with me, and of course Jordan for their help with this event. Thanks to Nihar Patwardhan for administrative logistics for today. Over to you, Jordan, to introduce the panelists and start the event. Thank you, everyone.
Great, thanks a lot, Kumar. Welcome, everyone, and we have a great and important event. As Kumar mentioned, this is about startup fundraising and strategy during the pandemic. And if you're in a startup, it may be, a confusing time. If you're thinking of starting a startup, it may be similar. So what I'd like to do is do a brief intro for each of the speakers. We have a great set of investors who are very active in the Silicon Valley ecosystem, primarily early stage. And so we have Ashmeet Sidana. He is the chief engineer at Engineering Capital. We have Jean Kovacs. Jean is a partner at Hillsven Capital. She's the chair of the Harvard Business School Alumni Angels of Northern California. We also have Nuno Goncalves Pedro. Nuno is a partner with Strive Capital. And then we have Jennifer Vancini. Jennifer is a partner at Mighty Capital. So I'll be asking questions of the panel in just a moment. What I'd like to do first is just set a little bit of context. So, this period of time, you've probably been seeing from the stock market and from the news that there are good times for some people, there are difficult times for others. To quote Charles Dickens, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. So this is, how can that be? What is really happening here? So let me just share a presentation and let's take a look. What we'll do is we'll start out briefly with the bad part, the difficult times. So startups are known as disruptors, and it looks like they are being disrupted. So since March 11th, so not even 2 months, we're seeing over 42,000, or let's just say 40,000 employees laid off by startups. And this is a global number, so this is not just in the Silicon Valley area. Just a couple of weeks ago, layoffs.fyi, or layoffs, they had built a tracker, and you can see that up until April 21st, so this is about 2 weeks ago, there were just over 20,000. So we've had a doubling of the layoffs in just the last 2 weeks. You probably heard just recently about Uber and Airbnb. They're not exactly startups, but they are a barometer for the startup community. as we have almost 400 startups that are being counted with layoffs. At this time, there were about 6,000 in the Bay Area that had been laid off. It's probably at least double that for now with these large layoffs So this is kind of the bad aspect of, what's been going on with these disruptive startups that are out there that were doing incredibly well in many cases and now doing layoffs. If we take a quick look at what's happening, this staying at home, we're all online. So for those that are trying to get customers, that's more difficult. So about 30% of the layoffs are in sales. Working with customers, about 21%. So you're looking at over 50% of areas of the company, but those are the two that are being impacted the most. Now, if we look at other events that are similar in terms of being a recession and a downturn, there's an interesting pattern that is known as the Great Recession. And if you look at .com, it's similar. But what happens is after a certain period of time, obviously during the downturn, and it's a very confusing time, but in the aftermath of what's called the recovery, the angel and seed, both in terms of deal value as well as just the total number of deals, tends to have an uptick. The early stage, usually what would be considered Series A, as well as the late stage, so B, C, D, there's a bit of a downturn because these companies are, in a revenue generating mode. Now, there are quite a few companies in revenue generating mode that are doing better than they expected. We're all here on Zoom, and Zoom has, 30 times as many customers as it had, just a couple of months ago. So if you take a look at post-recession activity, both in .com as well as the Great Recession, this is a graphic from Silicon Valley Bank. What you can see is there are these new disruptors that get born, and they understand. Right now, we have everybody online, and that's being accelerated. I often remember in 2001, right at the time of the 9/11, there was another company called WebEx, which was one of the first that did things like, online kind of a telepresence, and they got a big boost. So it was similar. But you can see that the deeper the recession, potentially, what you see here is the unemployment rate. And the unemployment rate here is, off the charts. So it's kind of, not really comparing apples and apples. But there's quite a few companies that you're probably familiar with. Uber, for one, Pinterest, Waymo, Okta, etc., Airbnb. These disruptors were very disruptive right after the last, the Great Recession, and now they are being disrupted themselves in this new recession. If we take a look at the birth of unicorns, actually 2009 was the biggest year for the birth of new unicorns. One other point I just would like to say is that in addition to Airbnb and Cloudflare, GitHub, these types of companies which are very well known in the Silicon Valley, Bitcoin was also born, and that actually led to the blossoming of the blockchain ecosystem, in the last 7. So yes, you have very difficult times, but there's a silver lining that new disruptive companies can be born. And right in the aftermath is actually when you can have the most blossoming of this new set of disruptive companies. So I just wanted to give that context. And now let's stop sharing, and we'll get back to the questions. So the first question, and this is really an intro, is, and maybe we can start with Ashmeet. let's each of you just go through and tell us a little bit more about yourself, your fund, and your investing style.
Thank you, Jordan. Very happy to be here today. I run Engineering Capital, which is a seed stage venture capital firm investing in software companies that still have technical risk. In other words, there's a technical insight, which is unusual in software. You would think here in Silicon Valley, a lot of companies take technical risk. In reality, they mostly take market risk. I invest in that earlier stage when there is still technical risk in those companies. My background is as an operator. Before venture capital, I was at VMware running product management for ESX server. That product, of course, became the killer product for the company and really resulted in the massive company that we see today. So very fortunate to have been there. And I like to go very early, currently managing a total of $80 million. And I'm the only partner at Engineering Capital.
Great, thanks, Ashmeet. Jean? Oh, Jean, I think you're muted.
There. Hi, everyone. First, I want to thank Jordan and Radhika for inviting me to this. I have to say, I think the TiE conference is one of the best conferences we have in Silicon Valley, and I'm thrilled to be part of it. My background has been mostly on the operations side. I've been with several startups. The most recent one, I was CEO, and we sold that to AT&T. And after that, I decided I wanted to work with a lot of companies as opposed to just one. And I got involved with the HBS Alumni Angels, which has now grown to 14 chapters globally. And a few years ago, I joined Hillsven. And Hillsven is also a seed venture fund. We focus on enterprise companies, enterprise software, all B2B. And we do a few deals a year, but some of our companies are companies such as Expensify or Retail Zipline, Tesorio, and a few companies like that. So it's, again, it's really exciting to be here.
Great, thanks for that, Jean, and thanks for being here. Nuno, can you give us an overview?
Sure, I'm managing partner and founder at Strive Capital. We're an early stage investor, mostly Series C and Series A. First fund very focused around the mobile app ecosystem, and more recently, more broadly focused around software as a service and enterprise software beyond the usual consumer software space. Companies that we invested in would include App Annie, Gusto, Rubrik, and a few other well-known household names, including DraftKings, just went public through a reverse merger. I'm also a venture partner at Christian Robotics, which is a physical tech fund focused on Sand Hill Road, which is more focused around Series A and Series B investments. And on top of that, I'm the co-host and founder of Tech Deciphered, which is a podcast that I do with Bertrand Schmidt, the co-founder of App Annie. And I also am a big proponent of rejection and adversity as a path to growth. So very excited about the current times that we're in, although they're not all positive, as Jordan, you alluded to.
Thanks, Nuno. And Jennifer, you're currently muted, so if you could give us a little bit of an overview, that'd be great.
Great, thank you, Jordan. And those were great slides, I think, to start us out. I'd love to get a copy. So I'll follow up with you on that. But I'm a co-founding partner of Mighty Capital, and we invest primarily in the early growth stage, a lot of Series A, Series B. You may see us doing later seeds given the market dynamic. We typically invest in companies where there's a very strong product ethos, product culture, because we give access to a business acceleration platform called Products Account to our portfolio companies. My own background was primarily, before I got into investing, as an operator with experience in the cybersecurity, mobile enterprise ecosystems, working in telcos, startup innovation groups and large companies, including telcos and management consulting.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. So there you have it, a set of earlier stage investors that are experts with significant experience as operators as well as VCs. So like all investors have a portfolio of companies, and in this time you know, it's very important the startups come to the investors and look for advice. You know, what advice are you giving to your portfolio companies? And I understand it depends. Obviously, companies are in different positions. But how do you look at it? How do you deal? Do you put the companies into different buckets? Do you see certain categories that companies are falling into? And so what type of advice are you giving them during this disruptive time?
And maybe I'll take a stab at it. I use a pretty simple framework. There's really three types of markets that you can be in as a startup right now. You're either in a cyclical market or in a counter-cyclical market. If you're in a cyclical market, your company is necessarily aligned with the economy, either positively or negatively correlated. And if you're in a counter-cyclical market, the current market situation doesn't affect you at all. So stepping to the other side of the fence, if I'm looking at it as an investor, basically, if I'm looking at a cyclical company that's positively correlated, the key thing I need to de-risk is the peak condition, right? So your company's doing really, really well right now. You're in the gaming space, you're in the social space, people are consuming your services like hell. Is this going to withstand the test of time once we're out of shelter in place and things recover is the key question that most investors are going to have. So if I'm within the realm of the company, the key questions I'm going to have are around scalability, not scaling too fast and then not be ready for potentially the break from peak that will come after. Basically managing your habits and the habits of your users once they're no longer in an environment of shelter in place. Basically managing the product and pricing as people come out of it, et cetera. So that would be the questions I would have. If you're in a cyclical company that unfortunately is negatively correlated, so you're getting sort of by the market, like if you're in the travel space, for example, it's incredibly difficult to fundraise right now. So I would recommend that you try everything that you can to fundraise from potentially alternative sources. It will be difficult to raise from institutional sources and more classic sources. And you need to optimize for staying alive, and where you live to fight literally another day. So figure out what your cut to the bone scenario is. If you need to really stay zombie for a period of time, it's not a great scenario, but figure out what it would look like and figure out the timing by which you need to decide to move to that scenario. Okay, and this is a fascinating question. I asked this from a lot of entrepreneurs, and some of them, even if they had the first part figured out, they haven't figured out the second part, which is the timing. And timing is really important, because if you have 4 months runway and your timing is in 2 months, we'll decide, it will probably be too late. But it's really about staying alive for those companies. And it's very sad, it's very unfortunate, but it's about staying alive. And then the counter-cyclical question is really about contagion. Is your market really immune to contagion, or is it going to be affected by whatever comes next? And that will be the question in the minds of most smart investors as well. Is this something that's just immune to the current market conditions, or will there be a contagion, let's say in 3 or 4 months, when this market will slip into it? So that's how I would think about it from just a taxonomy and typology type of perspective.
Thanks, Nuno. That was quite helpful.
No, you've given a great, sorry, Jordan.
No, go for it, Ashmeet.
No, you've given a great framework that I would call as a top-down or a macro framework in terms of how to think about these companies. Let me give a micro framework or a bottoms-up view of what I told my CEOs on March 9th. I do a standing call with all my CEOs, and it was clear at that point that we were dealing with something very unusual and dramatic. And so here's what I told them. 3 things that you need to think about. Number 1, take care of yourself and your people. This is a healthcare problem. If you don't take care of yourself, nothing else matters. So don't get on planes, watch out for health, think about that. Number 2, cash is king. The market has just gone through a massive disruption. Cash is king, which means every place where you were spending money, think about spending half. Everything that you were getting in return, think about getting double back in return. So the cost, the value of your money has gone up dramatically. And number 3, play offense. Your goal is still the same, to build a long-term enduring business, but the game has changed. The playing field is now completely different. You win by playing offense, so don't get into a defensive posture within the constraints and, of course, the custom alternatives that you have to look on an individual basis for each company, whether you're a cyclic and a counter-cyclic, how much runway you have, etc. You've got to play offense. That's the only way the Silicon Valley game works.
Great. Thank you,
So
Ashmeet.
just to add to what Ashmeet and Nuno said, we looked at our portfolio and divided them into 3 loosely defined buckets. Those who, for whatever reason, could actually benefit from this, those who are neutral, that maybe with some positioning could benefit but would stay alive, and then those who we knew would be adversely impacted. If you might remember the Sequoia memo, the Black Swan memo, as many people call it, that memo said all companies should look and have at least 18 months of cash on the balance sheet. One of our companies, Tesorio, actually did a webinar where they brought in 3 name brand CFOs, guys like Jeff Epstein, who was CFO of Oracle, and 2 others who had already managed through downturn. And they all said you should have 24 months on the balance sheet. And so we sat down with each of our companies and said, take a good hard look at how long is your runway. And if you don't have 18 months, take a good hard look at whether or not you can raise money, or do you have to make cuts? And if you have to make cuts, make them now. The next discussion that we had with them is, are there ways that you can, pivot's too strong of a word, but maybe you can focus your product as a way to actually provide benefits to people dealing with this. So we have a retail product that really highlighted their compliance issues, which is going to be key when we open back up. And then the third thing we talked about with all of our companies is, could this be a slingshot moment? You know, Jordan, you brought out that some phenomenal companies have started during downturns. And why is that? It's because it makes you focus back on your core business and your core strengths. And there could be things that young companies can do to take advantage of this that the bigger, more cumbersome companies can't do. So we really tried to work with each of our companies to say, what are some opportunities that you could be taking advantage of now?
Great. Thank you, Jean. That was really insightful. And Jennifer?
And I actually don't have much to add to that. I think we're all on the same page in how we approach this, looking at the market, looking at the companies. So one thing I would add is that may be applicable to some of the audience is we told them to re-look at those forecasts and forget your best case scenario. Don't even go there, right? Look at realistic scenarios, worst case scenarios with an eye to 18 to 24 months. And looking at, you know, who needs to survive and who needs to, we don't want to just see survival. Somebody pointed that out. You want to see growth, and what are the areas you need to focus on. But go back to your forecast. Don't be overly optimistic. It's time to be very pessimistic.
Great. Well, thank you all. I think if I can just do a quick summary, it looks like there are really 3 different types of companies or buckets that company could fall into: those that are doing well, those that are not doing so well, and those that it's hard to say, right? It's kind of neutral. And cash is king, right? And, you know, try to get as much as possible. If you're only looking at 4 to 6 months, see if you can get to 18 to 24. That's a lot of money for an early stage startup. What does that mean? That means cuts, becoming a lot more frugal. If you're lucky and actually you're doing really well, just keep going, do more, but make sure that it's sustainable. And if you're not doing so well, see if you can pivot. So I think those were really, really good, you know, insights. In terms of companies that are just forming right now, so those that, you know, aren't necessarily being impacted, what would you say, you know, what type of advice would you give companies that are just forming now, or that maybe are just getting ready to launch? And so, you know, Jennifer, what would be your thoughts?
Yeah, I think we've seen in these downturns, it's a great time to start a company. And we will see a lot of it with all of those layoffs. People want to go make something out of it, you know, that are able to do it. So, you know, certainly the advice is really work hard on that product market fit as soon as possible in the process. Make sure it's a big enough market, but also bootstrap. Be frugal, bootstrap, be realistic about the sacrifice that you're going to have to make, because it is going to be much harder to raise capital, but there's a really great checks and balance that kind of comes with that. And so a lot of what we see getting formed is going to be more fundable as they go into their later growth stages.
Sure. Thanks. Ashmeet?
You know, I'll add one aspect to this idea, which I agree with, that this is a great time to start a company, and being in downturns actually has many advantages to startups. It actually plays to the strengths of startups versus big companies, which is that the average time for a successful startup, let's say define that as an IPO or a large acquisition, let's say 1 billion or greater, you know, those are very long periods, 7, 8, 10 years, anytime you measure it. They're very long periods, which means you're almost guaranteed that if you're going to build a successful startup, you are going to go through a recession. The only question is, at what point in your journey do you go through a recession? And so that's the way I counsel entrepreneurs to think about it. At some point, you will have a good market. At some point, you will have a bad market. If you're building an enduring business, you have to think about what is it that makes you enduring and what are the advantages that will let you succeed.
Yes, that's a very nice insight. Thank you. Jean?
I was going to say, Ashmeet, I love that thought that at some point you're going to have a bad market. So, which is so true. And I think, Jordan, in terms of your slides, you showed some phenomenal companies have come out of downturns. So I would say two things. Number one, you're going to have less competition. And number two, you better get used to it. Valuations are going to go down. So investors are going to take all the risks inherent in the market and some of the uncertainty, and your valuations are going to go down. But better to have a low valuation now and get that behind you and show some phenomenal growth. And I have to say, having lived through some downturns myself and worked with a lot of might not realize it now, but you'll become a better entrepreneur and a better leader. And the things that you learn by managing your team and figuring out the market and growing and developing products today in this time, I promise you, you will look back and go, you've just grown so much in terms of being a leader and an entrepreneur. So it's not all bad.
Yeah, definitely. And like you had mentioned, it's very much about survival and taking it to the next level. Nuno, anything to add?
Yes, I mean, when I look at companies, typically I would look at product, at market, and at team. I do agree this is a phenomenal time to start a company from a team perspective in terms of getting talent from the market, because there's so many layoffs, there's so much talent out there, and people that really are capable that want to take it to the next level. But at the same time, there's two things about this crisis that we're in. I do think this is the most significant economic crisis, not only of our time, but probably of any time that's measurable. And it is a phenomenal crisis because it's a health crisis. It's a social crisis. It's a habit-changing crisis. This is not just a financial crisis or economic crisis. That's
Sure.
one of the underlying aspects of it. And that creates a tremendous lack of clarity on two things. On product, because what are the habits that are going to stick and the habits that are not going to stick? I mean, we all sort of are betting that will give momentum to remote working, but nobody can be absolutely sure about it. Everyone believes that the consumption of gaming and entertainment is going to continue going through the roof. We can't be absolutely sure about it. So it creates a lot of instability in thinking about product and user habits that you're trying to fulfill. The second piece, that's even for me the biggest piece, is market clarity. What the hell's going to happen, right? And so I would say I do believe it's a great time to start a company, precisely because it's probably one of the worst times to start a company in some ways. So it's great because of that. If you can raise as much cash as you can, if you're in the position where you can raise more cash. I was talking to an entrepreneur the other day who was raising 500K on a note, 450K were already spoken for. I was like, you probably can raise more. Why don't you raise more? Oh, I only need 500K. 3 days later told me, oh, I thought about raising more money. I'm now raising $1 million. I'm at 950K. 3 days later, she was at 1.5 million. And I was like, great, that's the way to go. If you're hot and you can raise and people believe in you, just go and raise as much cash as you can. So my advice right now is think very thoughtfully, in particular, about the market you're about to enter, and have at least a little bit of certainty that that market's going to be there in 18 months, 2 years, that you're not just going into something that's just going to fundamentally implode. Again, I think this is a great time to start companies, but at the same time, this is a crisis that creates so much variability in thinking, so much lack of clarity for everyone involved in the ecosystem, investors, our own investors in venture capital, our own limited partners, that it's very difficult to just say, well, this is fantastic. Well, it's not fantastic. It's really, really tough. But if you can make it right now, you can make it at any time. I think that's the good news.
So Nuno, just because you were talking about areas that could be successful during this time, what areas might benefit? You had mentioned gaming, and obviously there's stuff like media and shopping from home and online. What do you think?
I'll share my 2 cents as an old school strategist. I hope I'll be right at least on some of them, on the majority. I don't know if I'll be right on all of them. I think the fundamental role of the home is going to change. This is the time where smart home, Internet of Things, in the home, anything that relates to the home in terms of well-being and fitness, in terms of entertainment, is going to have a natural propeller and momentum. I think homes are going to become our next basic unit. People are going to really try to optimize whatever conditions they have in their home for the future. So homes will become our castles, literally. The second thing that I think is fascinating to me is digitization is unavoidable right now. So anything needs to be digitized. Any industry needs to be digitized. So if there's legacy stuff out there that touches end consumers or customers that hasn't been digitized, that naturally is an opportunity if that industry is going to sustain itself. So that's another thing I would look at and spend quite a bit of time on. Obviously, remote work goes without saying. I do think this is the final piece of momentum for it. I think work will fundamentally shift. On the negative side, I do think travel is going to change a lot. I'm not saying the nomadic lifestyles that many people seem to have now are necessarily going to implode. But for example, business travel, I'm incredibly pessimistic on. I think the bar for business travel is going to go much higher. So why are you going to do 150 flights a year like I used to do when I was at McKinsey for 6 years? I used to do 150 flights a year. Why? Well, that's not going to work anymore. The bar for those flights is going to become higher, both for the organization, but also for the individual, which will say, well, you know what, I'm just, I don't think I need to go to that meeting. I can probably do a remote conference, etc. So those would be just 3 of things that I've been thinking about. I'm sure there's a lot more.
Sure. No, so that's great. So the home, digitization, and travel, or not. Jennifer, your thoughts?
Around the kind of new opportunities.
Yeah, like specific areas.
I think on the
benefit.
Kind of on the consumer side, recession, small luxuries that make people feel good that they can kind of afford, are appealing. You would think, why go into a consumer product that's expensive? I don't mean a $2,000 handbag, but those little things that make people feel a little bit good and can gift. And we don't focus a ton on consumer, but kind of the other side we haven't touched on is healthcare. The healthcare system, the cracks in it are showing. Telemedicine, remote monitoring, remote care, more efficient care, the whole record keeping system, major challenges. So it's going to be a challenging area to develop properly, but there are definitely needs in that space. So we're going to see a lot more in there. And some sectors that are not COVID are on pause right now, but things like cancer don't go away. Things like cardiac disease don't go away. So better ways to manage those patients, that patient care. There definitely are going to be opportunities in that space.
Great. Yeah, so healthcare is huge. Jean?
We look at everything obviously with an enterprise lens. And so the 3 areas that we've been looking at is we do believe that social distancing is here to stay, whether it's work from home or in an office. And what we're seeing is how some of our companies actually help with that, especially some of the workflow applications that we have, that you don't have to be sitting in an office to achieve the next step in a business process. So we're looking at some of those areas. We're looking at companies that help somehow better manage cash flow or accounts receivable. We think cash is going to be something the enterprise, dramatically cares about. And then the third area is compliance, where, as I mentioned earlier, we have a retail company focused on retail employees. Well, when employees come back to work, they're going to have to be focused on compliance of all their employees. So how do you make sure your product can help with that? We're looking at a company right now that helps small and medium businesses do compliance in regulated industries. So I think you'll see, just like we're seeing today, the government, whether it's state or federal, taking a major role in the business life and the personal life of people. The way that you handle that is you make sure you're complying. And so those are the three areas that we're most excited about right now.
Great, thanks, Jean. And Ashmeet, you know, you're doing a lot in the infrastructure and the cloud space. What are you seeing as good trends there?
So Jordan, I think it's very clear that we are seeing an acceleration in a secular trend, which was the transition to the cloud. So digital transformation, transition to the cloud is only going to accelerate. We talked about how Zoom has been growing so quickly. This is a trend. Zoom just signed a deal with Oracle. There is currently on Amazon. This is just a trend which is going to continue. The second secular trend, which I believe will perhaps accelerate, but certainly continue at its blistering pace, is the adoption of artificial intelligence and how we will use AI in many different new ways of thinking about it, and also the implications of AI on the underlying infrastructure, which are quite dramatic and I think not appreciated by a lot of people in terms of the impact they're having through the end of Moore's law, et cetera. Another trend which I think will accelerate is the use cases and the proliferation of cybersecurity as an essential need in all different aspects, certainly for business, but also for individuals. And within the cybersecurity domain, I recently made a presentation on a trend called data is the new oil. That's a general trend that people have been talking about for a long time. But data is also the new asbestos. In other words, data is toxic. Data will cause cancer, and it can kill your company if you're not careful in terms of how you think about managing it. So those are some of the trends that I'm looking at. But again, at the end of the day, great companies are started when an entrepreneur has a fabulous technical insight, a fabulous market insight, a fabulous consumer insight, and then can build a business behind it. So there's no limit to human creativity, and I'm always looking for the next new idea.
Great. Well, thank you all for those insights. I'll just add very quickly a few more thoughts. As everyone gets more and more online, trust, which has been kind of missing, is going to become more and more important. And so we're seeing that trust and how you ensure trust, obviously cybersecurity is part of that, identity is another, but then just trusted information is going to be very important. And also supply chains. Supply chains we've seen are very broken, and there are very fundamental reasons for that. And actually blockchain, working with AI and IoT and other technologies are good solutions in those cases. So I'd just like to ask
Jordan,
one more question.
if I can just build on what you're saying.
Yeah, sure.
If I could just build on what you're saying, I think COVID-19 has fundamentally disrupted our assumptions on privacy.
Yes.
There was this general notion that we had some privacy, and we came from what I would call a very 18th century view of how privacy worked, which had been eroding over decades and decades. I still remember the famous quote from Scott McNealy when he talked about when the internet took off, when he talked about the death of privacy. But that really was an evolution. With COVID, we have a fundamental one-time disruption. Who would have thought that Apple and Google would be collaborating on a contact tracing application, which
Yes.
people would want to adopt? So, we're just going to see a fundamental rethink over there, which of course is great for startups and entrepreneurs. You can think of a new way of a new insight over there, and you could create an entirely new company. Mark Zuckerberg had the insight that we would be willing to give up our privacy, some aspects of our privacy, and he's built, a multi-$100 billion company on that observation.
Right. And I think there's some counter trends as well, and we'll have to see what happens in the balance. So in terms of something that Nuno had talked about at the very beginning, and we've talked about how maybe an 18 to 24 month runway is kind of a minimum right now in order to make it through what we're going through. But Nuno, you had mentioned something about, that the pandemic might create some long-term changes in consumer or business behavior. And so maybe just because you're doing well now, maybe you're not necessarily going to do well later. So maybe people are looking, to your point, Ashmeet, maybe people are looking and saying, hey, there's this contact tracing from Google and Apple, that would be great. And then maybe 6 months later or a year later, it's like, oh no, I don't think that's such a good idea because I don't want to give up so much. So, the circumstances might push certain behaviors in the near term, but are they going to last? And so, whoever would like to take that up first, Nuno or Ashmeet, Jean?
Yeah, let me
Let me give a contrarian view.
Sorry.
Jennifer?
Kind of quickly, almost every day we're like, people are creatures of habit. And, how much will that tendency push against, okay, but this particular behavior could get me or my family sick. Do we have to learn, how many people are going to have to learn the hard way? After 9/11, we expected massive changes, and okay, there are at the airport, but maybe not as massive as people expected. I do agree this is a little different because of the longevity, and you can't control this. Mother Nature has her own kind of agenda sometimes, right? It's not a foreign power.
Sure.
So that creature of habit, human behavior, tendency versus what we know to be, the case, the heart versus the head. So just a quick comment, but something we talk about a lot is, and I think we'll have to see how it plays out over the next couple of years.
Definitely. Thanks, Jennifer.
Jennifer, not only are people creatures of habit, we are also slaves to our DNA. I grew up on a farm in India, so I often look back and I think about what are things that have existed for millennia that I know are not going to change. And let me share one with you over here. I believe that human beings want to meet in person. There is something magical when you can give someone a hug, when you can shake their hands, when you can kiss them on the cheek, when you can sit across a table, break bread with them. That will never go away. And therefore, all of the friction and resistance and problems that we have right now, we will actually work against them. I completely agree with Nuno that for the next year, flying is going to be terrible. I would hate to be in the airline business. I'm ecstatic and thrilled that I'm no longer global services on United. I've had that crutch that I've had to carry in the past, so I know what it takes to do that. However, in the long term, I believe the value of the in-person meeting will never diminish. And so perhaps it will move to the top, perhaps it will become harder, perhaps it will be more exclusive. We will never lose those trends. And so you will have these countervailing forces that will exist in the market. And the job of an entrepreneur is to find that opportunity. Where is it that exists? Where is it that we can find a crack in the market that you can build a business on?
Sure.
Habits get formed by repetition and longevity, right? It's like you repeat the same thing for a significant period of time, you form a habit, right? And habits basically get formed on the notion of utility and the notion of addiction or stickiness.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is there could be a habit that's highly addictive, like playing a game and you get incentives and dopamine and everything and you're doing it in the same way, but there's also utility value. This crisis right now has those four ingredients. It's going to take a while, right? It's not going to be a 1 month, 2 months thing. We might even have yo-yo effects later down the road. It might be an 18-month thing, certainly until we potentially have vaccines or some way of controlling this in a much better way. We have repetition because people are in the same place at the same time all the time. There's a utility value. I mean, to the point, Jennifer, you're making, should I do this or not do this because I might die or I might get my whole family infected, right? So there's a significant utility in that. And then there's the component of addiction at the end. So I agree with you, Ashmeet, that there will be things that will go back to normal. At some point, we'll go back to normal on certain elements. I can't possibly believe that we will stop traveling altogether, for example. Sure. But there will be some significant habits that will just fundamentally change. How we treat hygiene, how we treat our privacy in it right now and afterwards, how we treat our own entertainment at home, etc., how we treat going into a public space with a lot of people and what the bar is for that. All of those things I think will fundamentally shift. And the cool thing here is nobody knows what it will change. No, it would be cool to do this again, this panel again in 3 years' time or 5 years' time, and go back to our predictions and say, well, we were right about that, we were wrong about that. For me, that's the cool thing. There will be a lot of habit forming. This crisis is fundamentally different because it changed the context under which we act in terms of spatial context and also in terms of social context. It's dramatic because of that. It's not just because there's less money in the market and there's a supply of capital issue. And it's not just because a bunch of tech companies imploded or telecom companies imploded. This is very different in that standpoint.
Just to add to what Nuno said, we brought in last week via Zoom a drug discovery person who spent the last 40 years developing vaccines and drugs to deal with viruses. And one of the things he told our CEOs was, our life will not go back to the way we knew it before until there is a vaccine that's known, can be replicated and widely available. And that realistically is 3 to 5 years. So it gave us all a context to think, okay, in 3 to 5 years, what could become habits? And I agree, there'll always be travel because we're humans. But I think, as Nuno said, I think we'll develop new habits that Zoom is fine. Plus, we have a whole crop of young entrepreneurs and business people that this is going to be their normal from day one. So I do think smart companies are going to think about what's going to happen 3 to 5 years from now. Maybe it's not as dramatic as it is now, but there will be things that change, especially on the business side.
Thank you.
And the smartest companies are not only the ones that are thinking about what is going to change. In other words, they are not only reacting, they are also thinking about what change can they create. What can they do which will drive a different set of behavior? Mark Zuckerberg, not only did he leverage the internet and our expectations of privacy, he has fundamentally lowered the expectation of privacy and the amount of privacy that exists because of what he did. And therefore, the outcomes are path dependent. Great entrepreneurs drive change because they understand and can take a set of different ingredients and you end up in a different place because they have done it. And that is the opportunity that entrepreneurs have today. Because we have this massive disruption, we have the fog of war, lots of things are unknown, they're not really understood. Maybe it's 3 years till we get a vaccine, maybe it's 1 year. I don't know. Nobody knows. Nobody can give that answer. Great entrepreneurs will take that uncertainty and drive change through that.
So let's take some questions from the audience. One of the questions that we got, Ashmeet, you were talking about Mark Zuckerberg and, that has ridden really on changes in behavior for millennials, right? Consumer trends, and the sharing economy and things like this. So are there going to be any significant impacts on the sharing economy and millennial consumer trends? Obviously travel, we've already talked about, but what about some of the other areas?
I'm not an expert in that, so I'll defer to others
Sure.
who may know those spaces more. I was just using Mark's example in terms of a great entrepreneur. So why don't I defer to the others on the sharing economy? It's not a space I know.
I would say one immediate one is around hygiene and cleanliness. This is pretty obvious, but Airbnb will need to figure out, how do they actually create a very heavy duty standard around cleaning properties under which people are staying at? How do they make that available to hosts, etc.? Uber, Lyft, all of those things, the dynamic around hygiene as a very basic thing and the expectation of it has just changed dramatically. I do think there's going to be a pull towards maybe more longer term stays. We've seen Airbnbs already figuring that out. They're like, people will stay longer in that space, but just like hopping around like a hotel, maybe not for a while. So that maybe is a habit forming issue and how you use it. I think anything that's, economy sharing that has sort of a low bar to use, very low expectation of impact on health, etc., is going to be fine. There's not going to be a dramatic impact on it.
Sure.
One question mark, grocery shopping is going to go through the roof all around the world. I have no doubts about that. It already is.
Yeah.
Food delivery is more complex, actually. Food delivery has become more complex. We've seen certain parts of the world that had actually dramatic drop-offs on food delivery. China, in many of the cities, had dramatic drop-offs during lockdown and shelter in place. We've seen in the UK, initially, food delivery had huge drop-offs. Grocery shopping did not. So that's again where there are pieces of the economy and the sharing economy and how, you know, these different acts are acting that I don't think we can predict yet. I have no clue on food delivery. I would say I'd be in principle bullish about food delivery, that this finally is going to get food delivery to everyone's homes, that cloud kitchens are going to emanate, that all of that makes a lot of sense. And this is the time where it's going to happen. But actually, from some of the data we have from some countries, that's not true. It simply hasn't taken off. So I don't know. There are some areas where it's clear, hygiene, cleanliness, etc. Some areas where it's absolutely not clear to me.
Yeah, actually, I saw,
certainly in the short term. Certainly,
definitely. And I saw data out of China that people are starting to buy cars more because they're worried about who they're getting into a car with, for example.
Yes.
So kind of a reverse away from sharing to this is mine and I know it's clean. Yes. So that was those were some good comments. In terms of going back to AI and infrastructure, if we take a look at the next generation of enterprise apps, is there going to be some kind of a shift in terms of, you know, the metrics or, you know, how people are going to be assessing AI, or is it going to be staying relatively the same?
I saw that question and I think it's really interesting. I think there was a lot of hype around AI a year or two ago, and what we're now seeing is AI in service of a business need. So I do believe that if there's a business need and a solution, that then AI can be layered in on top of to be more efficient and more accurate. That's where you're going to see the wins.
Sure.
And I think you're going to look at, enterprises are going to look at business flow and the ability of moving things through the process, whether it's accounts receivable, accounts payable, installation, sales, anything that they can do. And AI can be really, really helpful in those cases. So we're excited about AI, but only in service of a business or enterprise need.
Definitely.
Yeah, I agree. I think it has to be very use case driven, and we've already seen a subtle shift towards using that technology to increase productivity and cost efficiencies. So making an enterprise kind of more productive and more, you know, to help to deal with like downsizing and credit risk and fraud and security issues, to the point that was raised about security, but very product and use case driven instead of AI, machine learning, algorithm driven.
Yeah. We're also seeing...
Jordan, I think we are in the very early innings of AI. And what many people don't realize is that AI is essentially iterative algorithms that are just working repeatedly on a piece of data. But that, and they think of them as linear or perhaps even exponential as smooth curves. But the reality is that there are tipping points. The reason we are talking about AI today is because neural nets went over a certain tipping point. Jeff Hinton's famous paper at ImageNet about 11 years ago now, 25% jump in 1 year had never been seen before. And suddenly AI is the next big thing and everybody's doing it. Google obviously starts using it for advertising very effectively and builds a behemoth company for themselves. And so now everybody's talking about AI. But we are in the early innings. The algorithmic efficiency of AI is also increasing quite dramatically. I was reading a paper just yesterday. I believe it's roughly about a 40x factor from the original ImageNet paper to today. In other words, it takes 40x less compute to get the same quality of recognition of inference on a set of images for performing AI, while we still have some increase in our compute capacity. So while Moore's law has slowed down, it's not quite dead. So we are seeing this beautiful thing where there are two things helping us in AI. And so we are going to hit tipping points. We've hit one tipping point, which Jean and Jennifer referred to, which is there are clear business use cases which are today being done with white-collar jobs, which will be replaced by AI. In fact, the lower-level white-collar jobs are the most susceptible to AI, and those are clearly going to get replaced. We have crossed that tipping point. What is the next tipping point? I don't know. And that, I think, is the most exciting thing about AI today.
Sure. Well, great. I think this may be our last question. We only have about 4 more minutes until we hit the top of the hour. And it's kind of complex. Healthcare. Healthcare, this is a healthcare pandemic, something that we've never experienced and hopefully will not experience again soon. though that's still to be determined. So in terms of healthcare, there's a lot of cracks in the system. Where do we start? Where are the key opportunities?
I think some of them have already started becoming very clear, which is there's regulation and there's processes that are being followed by agencies around the world, not just in the US, that are obsolete and do not make sense. And those already disappeared. This is the fascinating piece. They had to disappear because this was global and people had to react, and we had to fast track stuff. We had to actually take away stupid rules where doctors cannot do telemedicine across whatever state lines, etc. Those will be the first to go. And that's the great news, is that we will realize that those rules were not there for any good reason until now. So that's great. That's where it needs to go. The second part that I think is very positive about this pandemic is that there is almost a digital transformation that's by force. It's like in the last 2 or 3 months, we've gone through a core digitization of the world that may have taken us, Microsoft was saying 2 to 3 years. I think it may have taken us a decade.
Right.
So it's sort of a swim, or, sink or swim play. It's like you are an institution that cannot provide digital services to your customers. You are dead. Thank you very much. Okay, so that I think also applies in health. And so you have to have telemedicine services. You have to have basic services that allow you to communicate with your users in a fundamentally virtual way that's more efficient where we are today. I think that will happen first. The big difficult pieces to sort out are the system issues around insurance, pay provider system in the US, which is at the very least complex, not to say mind-bogglingly bad. All of that will take much longer to change. My hope is that because there's facilitation on regulations right now, there might be entry points for companies that are fundamentally what I would call attackers. Guys who just come into this and say, you know what, I'm going to create a great value proposition to end consumers, and they're going to benefit from my proposition. And because I have regulation for me right now, I'll take advantage of that. So my hope, and this is just a hope, literally, is that that will actually generate a couple of winners in the space that will show that you can do direct to consumer, that the obsolete guys are obsolete, that they will have to change their ways, and hopefully the whole system will have to change. That's the part that I'm most skeptical about, where I'm just very hopeful about.
Sure. Jennifer or Jean, you both mentioned healthcare. Any further thoughts?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Lots of cracks. The B2C thing, I agree. It's going to take someone in there to muscle their way through with a better proposition. I hate to say it. When I see a news story about somebody getting out of intensive care after 21 days, I'm like, then they're going to get the bill and have a heart attack, right? Like, what is this costing people? But aside from that, yeah, service delivery, but also I think we'll see more funding shift into that space. Right now. We personally focus on personalized medicine, where it intersects with big data and technology. So using technology to personalize care and treatments. I think it's been a slowly growing trend, but I think it's really going to accelerate now as well. One thing I'm kind of curious to see, we didn't talk about the geopolitical changes that could come out of all of this, and to what extent is now becoming a national security issue, and where is that going to create opportunities or fractures as well. But I think there certainly is going to be a lot of lobbying, there already is, from American companies to make sure they get the contracts for our healthcare supplies, and there could be opportunities there for startups.
Sure.
It's just that compliance, but also we see enterprises taking a more active role in healthcare for their employees. And so I think the personalized medicine and ways that enterprises can help their employees stay healthier. A lot more deals in the angels, where enterprises are actually buying solutions that their employees can tap into to maintain their health and well-being. So I think you'll see that as also an opportunity.
Well, thank you all. I don't know. Can we continue for a few more minutes, or are we done? Are we out of time? Because it's actually
a few more minutes. Go ahead.
Okay, great. So Ashmeet.
I was just going to add a thought on healthcare. I'm not an investor in the healthcare space, and I think Nuno, Jean, and Jennifer have made some interesting observations about that. But I can tell you that the healthcare space is rife with irrational and complicated incentives that are not obvious to the layperson from the outside. So any entrepreneur who's entering that, I would urge you to really understand what are the incentives truly at play over here. This has fundamentally been a services space. Obviously, it's a very large part of our GDP. Obviously, it is something that is very near and dear to us. It is something which has an their last dollar in return for healthcare. And so it is a very interesting and attractive space from there. But these incentive structures have to be understood by an entrepreneur if they are going to be successful. So I urge you to think about that. And then finally, I'll end by saying that my space has been in the areas surrounding healthcare. So we will certainly see AI to healthcare, artificial intelligence. We will see the changes in privacy, security, remote work. All of these are really software and technology at work. It's not really healthcare at work over there. And I do see opportunities being created over there.
Summarize with regards to healthcare, since there's a lot, is personalized, both consumer as well as enterprise focused. And then telemedicine, right? Tele-everything, that's pretty much across all spaces. And AI, so big opportunities, as well as this national security type of issue, which might bring more
blockchain, just to throw that in there, right?
Yes, for sure. Thank you, Jennifer. I was going to say the same. So thank you, everyone. And this was a great session. Like Nuno said, maybe we can do this again. 3 to 5 years, but maybe sooner.
Maybe less, yes.
See how everybody did on their predictions. There were lots more questions.
Stay safe, play offense.
That's right. Stay safe, everyone. Thank you for
Stay
attending.
safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Stay safe, everyone. Take care.
Thank you all on the panel again, and thank you to the audience. Bye.